Okay, hey guys. Today we're going to be talking about Locke's essay concerning human understanding, which historically continues our conversation of these things like knowledge and reality. So, to start off, I think it would be a good idea to read that first passage together so we get an idea of what Locke is talking about and what he is going to do. So, if you check out that very first paragraph, Locke says, before I proceed on what I have thought on this subject, I must here at the outset as to you excuse how frequently you will find me using the word idea in this book. It seems to be the best word to stand for whatsoever is the object of understanding when a man thinks. I have used it to express whatever is meant by phantasm, notion, species, or whatever it is that the mind can be employed about in thinking, and I could not avoid frequently using it. Nobody, I presume, will deny that there are such ideas in men's minds. Everyone is conscious of them in himself, and men's words and actions will satisfy him that they are in others. Our first inquiry, then, shall be how they come into the mind. Okay, so there's kind of two related questions happening in the background here. The first question is, very simply, what is an idea? Right? We use this word all the time. We say, I have an idea. We say other people have ideas. We relate ideas. We relate ideas to non-ideas and all that good stuff. So what exactly is it? Well, Locke is saying he's using the term to refer to whatever is the object of understanding. Right? So he talks about phantasm. So if I think of something like, I have an idea of a dragon, or even something simpler, I have an image of my cup of water in my mind, right? Not this cup of water, but I have an image of it in my mind. That's an idea, or a notion, or a belief. You know, maybe I believe that orange is a better color than blue, which I do. That's a notion, right? That's a belief. Or even something like an idea of a type, right? Like cups in general or trees in general. All these are ideas. So to start, because this question is going to kind of frame everything else we do, but to start, we can say that an idea is whatever is the object of thought. Making sure I spelled that right. So when we say object of thought, this word's going to get tricky, but you can understand it like this. So there's this process that happens in all of us, I'm assuming, right? Unless Descartes' right. But it's happening in all of us, and it's this thing that we call thinking. And thinking is this stream, right, of images and sensations and representations and all this stuff happening. So on the one hand, you have what we can call like the act of thought. Right? And this is the fact that you are thinking. So that's the arrow, right? The process of thinking. But then you have the thing you're thinking about, right? And we could put like a little X here, right? So the act of thought points to an object of thought. So let's say I'm thinking of an apple right now. We can say the thinking process is the arrow, right, is the act. And then the thing I'm thinking about is the idea. The apple I have represented in my mind is the idea. So that's what Locke is going to be talking about. He says we have ideas of everything, right? One way of looking at this is to say, wow, I guess maybe most things we have are ideas, right? Any idea of color, or of the future, or of the past, or of personality, or if you're thinking about how to do something in a class, these are all ideas. So we're constantly engaged in ideas. So what does Locke mean by idea? He means whatever it is that your mind is pointing at, so to speak. Okay? So that's the first question. The second thing Locke's going to be focusing on is where do ideas come from? Right? They're present in some sense to us in consciousness, but how does that happen? Right? How do they come about? Where do they come from? And that's what a large portion, I think, of the rest of the discussion is going to be about for today. But both of these are going to be in play. So, to understand where Locke believes ideas come from, we have to understand this notion of a position that's called empiricism. And empiricism was one of these key terms that I put on that sheet for you guys to look at. So if you looked up empiricism, you know that it's the belief that all knowledge is ultimately rooted in sensory experience. Right? So if you have knowledge of something, if you have an idea of something, this didn't just bleep into your head out of nowhere. It wasn't just implanted into your head by God, like some people think. Or you're not born with it by means of the structure of your brain, like some people think, right? Those people would call innatists, and Plato and Descartes and some modern contemporary people are like that. Locke is an empiricist, which means he thinks that when we're born, the mind is a blank slate. Meaning you're not born with any inherent ideas. So in the text, the translation we have says white paper. So sometimes you see people say white paper, sometimes you see blank slate, sometimes you see blank canvas, or the most popular term is this phrase tabula rasa. And some of you will have heard this because I think it's a TV show now, but Locke is saying the mind is a tabula rasa. And what he means by that is simply that your mind is blank, right? When you're born as a baby, you don't have any ideas. Your ideas have to come from somewhere, right? The question is, if you don't have ideas, where do they come from? And similarly, how do they get from that place that they come from to your mind? Now, to understand this process, we have to refer to this diagram, let's call it. And this diagram is in action all throughout the history of metaphysics and epistemology. So it has to do with the difference between what we're going to call subject and object. So here's the subject, right? This is me, right? This is the conscious being. This is the stream of consciousness. And the subject is interacting with objects. All right, so we're going to split this diagram into two. And don't get hung up on the fact that I've drawn a body. That's kind of confusing. Just think of this as thought, right, as the stream of consciousness. So Locke wants to say that we're born with no ideas, but we get ideas from sensory experience. You know, your senses. You have sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch, right? All of these things provides us with the tools that enable us to have ideas. So the process goes something like this. The subject interacts with an object out in the world. It could be anything. It could be a tree, it could be a couch, it could be a marker, it could be a person, it could be the sky, it could be rain, literally anything. We encounter a world of objects. And what happens is there's a reaction between these two things. There's a reaction between the sense organs that the subject has and the properties of the object. Now what happens is the object impresses upon these sense organs, is a way we can say. The object affects your sense organs in a certain way. And it's only after the object affects your sense organs that you can have an idea of a tree. So the idea is that you can't have an idea, that's funny, you can't have an idea of anything that you haven't experienced previously through your senses. So if you had never seen a tree or heard of any of the properties that make up of a tree, you can't imagine what that is. Or it's like if I told you about some weird object that exists in some faraway country that you've never experienced, you wouldn't be able to imagine it, right? You wouldn't be able to have that thought. That's all Locke means. So there's this process of affection between the object and the subject that allows the subject to have an idea. And another way of thinking about an idea is a mental representation, because it's a representation of something outside of the mind. So for example, here's the marker, right? You guys can see the marker. Now if I remove the marker and I say think of the marker, you can. And when you're thinking of the marker, you're creating a representation. In other words, it's not the actual marker that you encountered, but it's some kind of representation of that marker that's intangible, right? And everything works like that. There's no idea you could have that isn't ultimately rooted in some kind of basic sensory experience of some object or set of objects or properties. You may be thinking, though, but isn't it true that I can imagine things that aren't real, that I've never experienced before, like a unicorn? You say, wait a second, I've never actually experienced a unicorn out in the world, yet I can imagine one. True, but your image in your mind of the unicorn is a combination of things that you have experienced with your senses. So you've experienced horses, and you've experienced horns, and you've experienced wings, whether it be in real life or in a cartoon or something. And all you're doing is putting that stuff together. So think of it like this. The encounters you have with objects furnish you with a toolkit or a set of different paints, right? And paintbrushes that you can then use to paint different images in your mind with. I think that's a good way of looking at it. And everything comes from that, right? Your ideas of tree, your ideas of green, your ideas of big, your ideas of small, of hard, of pain, all of that. So that's the basic model. That's what empiricism says. Empiricism is the notion that this can only happen through some fundamental sense experience. However, now we're going to get to the discussion post questions, because it asked you about the difference between primary and secondary qualities. Because there are properties or qualities or characteristics, whatever you want to call it, of objects, and they're not all equal. Some of those are primary, according to Locke, and some of those are secondary. So I'll ask you guys to try and figure out what the difference is and to give me some original examples. So let's see how this squares up with the ideas you guys had. So let's discuss primary qualities first. So first of all, what you should notice is the word primary, right? The fact that they're primary means that Locke is giving some kind of heavier level of importance to them, right? They're first in some sense. Well, what does he say primary qualities are? Let's take a look at the text. He talks about primary qualities on page 2, right? The ideas that make our complex ideas of bodily substances are of 3 sorts, and we're only focusing on 2. First, the ideas of the primary qualities of things, including the size, shape, number, position, and motion of the parts of bodies. Okay, so primary qualities include size, shape, motion, and position. These are the primary qualities, right? These are the first and foremost things that exist with an object. So if you talk about the tree again, you would say the primary qualities of the tree are its size, its shape, its motion, its position. Interestingly enough, all of these things seem to be spatial. So it might be helpful for you to think of primary qualities as spatial qualities of objects, right? All the characteristics it has that pertain to spatiality. And here's the thing about primary qualities. they exist in the object itself. And what I mean, that's kind of weird, because you might be thinking, wait, don't all of these things exist in the object? Not exactly. And that's how we're going to get to secondary qualities. But what do we mean by the object itself? Well, imagine, I'm looking at a tree right now. Maybe you're looking at your desk or a wall in your room or something, but I'm looking at a tree outside. So I keep using trees as an example. Now, if I leave, right, and I'm not engaged with the tree and I'm not looking at it, what Locke wants to say is that the tree, it's still there. The existence of the tree is not dependent upon my looking at the tree or feeling the tree or experiencing in any way, right? So things exist independently of our perception of them, according to Locke. So that's important to note. Locke believes in the existence of mind-independent objects, in the existence of an external world. Not all philosophers agree on that, and we're going to see when we get to Berkeley why that's the case. It may sound freaky to not believe in it, but actually there's some pretty good arguments to be made. So Locke believes that there are objects outside of us. And why he believes that, he's going to give us some proofs later. Take them or leave them, but these qualities really exist in the tree. If all humans disappeared, there would still be size, shape, motion, and position in all of the objects on Earth, right? However, you might notice these aren't all of the qualities that exist for us. Like, our world is not merely spatial stuff. And this is where secondary qualities come in. These are a bit different. The most obvious secondary quality that we haven't covered yet is color. So let's talk about color for a little bit. Not only do we see things in terms of spatial properties, but we see them in terms of these other sensory properties. And color is probably the easiest one to grasp. So, for example, I don't know, if I pick up something around here, let's see, like these scissors, right? I don't just see the shape of the scissors, I see the color of the scissors. And we say that the color's purple. Or if I look at this thing of Post-it notes, like that's blue. And it seems like everything we see has color. Now, what we have a tendency to do is to assume, it is an assumption, is to assume that color exists in the objects themselves. We say, hey, if I'm seeing blue on this magnet, that must mean that when I'm not looking at the magnet, it's still blue. And Locke wants to say, not true. It's not the case. Color does not exist independently of the mind. Color only exists in the mind. To be more specific, color only exists when there's an interaction between an object and a subject. It does not subsist in the object itself, which is kind of weird to think about because everything in the world has color, so it seems. That's not the case. So, if you know anything about how color is, just to kind of give you a quick little rundown, color is like, okay, you have eyes, right? And you're looking at something. What happens is there's light, and the light reflects off the object in a certain way to make it absorb certain frequencies and not absorb other frequencies. And the frequencies that are not absorbed get bounced to your eye, which then gets into your optic nerves and your color cones and all that, and then it sends a signal to your brain, right? And here is where color happens. Color does not happen there. That's a misconception. So it seems weird to think about, but what Locke is saying is that if all humans disappeared, color wouldn't be a thing. Let me rephrase that. It would be a thing if we're counting animal consciousness. So let's make a better statement. If there were no conscious beings that existed on the earth, color would not be there. Very bizarre. but not that bizarre when you think about it. It's not just color, though. It's actually all sensory qualities. So what do I mean by that? Color, smell, texture, sound, and taste. All of these things only exist within the mind of a subject experiencing an object. Let's take taste for a second. So if you take something like maple syrup, for example, you say, oh, maple syrup is sweet. That's a half truth. Maple syrup contains properties that when interacting with my taste buds and nervous system and brain produces sweetness. However, sweetness is not itself in the syrup. None of these qualities are in objects themselves. And that's why they're secondary, because they're not in the object, they're in the relation between the object to the subject. Now there's another reason why they're secondary. The second reason is because the secondary qualities are contingent or dependent upon the primary qualities. In other words, you can't have the secondary qualities unless you first have the primary qualities. And here's the easiest way to explain that. Take color, for example. Picture a color. Let's say yellow, right? Imagine yellow in your mind. Just yellow, right? The concept of yellow. What you're going to see is that you can't imagine yellow or color without first imagining a shape in which the color is taking place. That's why the secondary properties are dependent on the primary. No matter how hard you try, right? Even if you think of your mind as a completely seemingly spaceless plane where color is taking place, like I'm just thinking of yellowness, right? It's not actually spaceless because you can distinguish between points on that plane in your idea. So color requires shape, and that's because the secondary qualities depend on the primary qualities. So we just gave a bunch of examples regarding the tree, the marker, the scissors. So I think that should be helpful. Let's see. Okay, we got to get to the 4 proofs. But before we do that, I just want to make sure this whole process of how ideas come to be is clear. So just to give a little recap, I know some people are more visual learners. We would say, okay, first and foremost, there exist objects in the world, right? And this object contains a set of properties that we call primary qualities. And these primary qualities are mind independent. Meaning they don't need humans in order to be there. But then you have the subject. And the subject encounters whatever object. It could be a tree, it could be a desk, it could be a person, it doesn't matter. Now what happens is that the subject has these sense organs, right? Now the primary qualities affect the sense organs. And that process of affection is called perception. And I didn't mean for that to rhyme. It's called sense perception, right? Or sensation is another way Locke talks about that. Now what happens is once perception takes place, we could then have an idea, a representation of the object. Right? We don't have the actual tree in there, we just have a representation of the tree. And when we have the idea of the tree, it's not just the idea of the spatial qualities. Somewhere in this process, we're given these sensations by means of perception of color and smell and all that good stuff. So in the idea are these secondary qualities. clear, you know what, I'll make it even clearer. The secondary qualities are mind dependent. Right, and that's the idea. And that's how knowledge and reality work for Locke. There are things that exist with one type of property, and they affect us in a certain way so as to produce other properties, and then in ideas, we can combine these two sets of properties and create mental representation of the things that exist outside of us. And that's kind of empiricism in a nutshell, right? Because we don't have any of this prior to perception, is Locke's idea. Okay, that was the first question. But you might be wondering, especially if you're like a super skeptical or analytic person, okay, yeah, this process makes sense, but isn't Locke presupposing the existence of external objects? Like, how does he know that they're there? Because we know from Descartes, we could just doubt those things, right? Now, Locke is not dumb, right? Locke is not being presumptuous. He's going to give us some proofs that he thinks demonstrate clearly the existence of the external objects. And there are 4 proofs that we're going to go over. You could believe one of these, you could believe some of these, you could believe all of these, it doesn't matter. But hopefully this is going to support his claim that there exist mind-independent objects. And if it does that, then it grounds his theory of perception and empiricism and ideas and knowledge. So he has a whole system we could think about. So there are a couple of proofs here. And these happen, let's see, on what page? These happen on page 3, right? Paragraph 4, 5 on page 3, and 6, 7 on page 4. So the first proof has to do with, if we can list them here, the existence of sense organs. What do I mean by that? Well, to be more specific, Locke thinks there's a really undeniable relationship between the senses and the ideas, right? And he says this would seem to indicate that there's something outside of our ideas. Why? Okay. Imagine that someone is blind. Imagine that someone is completely blind and has been completely blind since birth. Let's say you go up to this person and you say, hey, think of the color red. Is that person going to be able to do it? No, it's impossible. It's impossible. And sometimes you'll see blind people talking about color. All they're doing is like making assumptions based on what other people have told them, but they can't even conceive of what vision is like, so they can't have color. Or similarly, if someone was deaf or couldn't smell and you tried to describe like music or the smell of flowers to them, they wouldn't be able to imagine it. So Locke's point is like, hey, listen guys, people who don't have certain sense organs aren't capable of having certain ideas. So a better way of saying this would be to say something like a lack of sense organs correlates with a lack of ideas. And not that they're not trying hard enough, just like literally they can't have those types of ideas. Therefore, it seems like there must exist something outside of your mind that's limiting the capacity of your mind. Because if everything was just ideas, then, hey, couldn't I have the idea of everything? And like saying, well, I guess not, right? Because clearly you can't tell a person who's never seen color to imagine color. So that must mean that there's some kind of external world outside of their mind that's limiting the things they could do, that's serving as the basis for all of their thought. Therefore, some type of external world must exist. Right, now that's one of the proofs. The second proof is interesting too, and it has to do with the fact that we can't avoid certain sensations. And the example I always think of is if you went outside right now without sunglasses and then just stared into the sun, like your eyes would hurt, right? Now, when you're staring into the sun and your eyes are hurting, could you tell yourself, you know what, I don't want that to hurt. Stop hurting. No, of course not, right? Similarly, if I put my hand on fire, provided that I have a typical nervous system with no defects or anything like that, and I put my hand on fire, the fire is going to hurt, right? It's going to burn me. Could I make it stop burning just by wishing it? No, you can't, right? So the fact that you can't avoid certain sensations seems to indicate that there's something outside of you, again, that's limiting what you can and can't do. If there was no external world, it seems like I could put my hand on the fire and say, hey, stop hurting. But I can't. I'm not infinite. So there must be something outside of me responsible for producing those sensations that I can't avoid. That is the second proof, and there's two more. Okay. This one we're going to wind up seeing when we do or you would wind up seeing if you did a different version of the Hume book we're going to read later in the semester. And this is the idea that there is a difference in the vivacity, I spelled that right, of, sensations and ideas. What does that mean? Okay. For some of you, I'm assuming that maybe you broke a bone before, or that you got really physically hurt. So think of yourself in that moment where you broke your arm, or your leg, or your collarbone, or where you got burnt, or where you got cut or something. In that moment, it hurt, right? But what I'm asking you to remember it right now, necessarily, your idea of what happened isn't going to be as vivid as the thing that actually happened. In other words, I can remember that time when I broke my arm without actually experiencing the pain that ensued when I broke my arm in that moment. And if you've never broke your arm, I mean, think of eating your favorite food, right? Let's say your favorite food is, I don't know, like spicy cheeseburgers or like jalapeno cheeseburgers or something. Now, when you're actually eating the food in the moment and you're having that live sensation, that's extremely vivid. However, let's say I'm starving right now and I can't go out until I finish work, or like you don't have enough money, or you're waiting until next week or something to go out. You could think about the jalapeno cheeseburger all you want, right? But your idea of what it tastes like is not going to be as intense, as good as the actual sensory experience of eating it. Therefore, there must be a difference between my ideas and the external world. Again, because there's a difference in the intensity of the world affecting me versus just my memory of it. So again, there must be something outside of me that affects me in a certain way. And the last proof is other people's reports, he says. So there's a marker here. If you guys were standing in front of me, you would say, yep, I'm holding a marker right now, this distance, from your face. And we would all agree on that, right? So I'm holding the marker, and you all would also agree that there's a marker there. That's it, right? Locke wants to say probably not everyone is wrong. One person can be hallucinated, two people can be hallucinating, maybe a small group of people can be hallucinating, but if every single person is agreeing on some basis of reality that we're experiencing, well, then maybe there's some basis of reality out there. And you might be thinking to yourself, yeah, but don't we disagree about some things? Like you would call that big and I would call that small. True, but we would both agree that it has a size, right? You might say, you look at this and you say it's green and I say it's blue. Isn't that a disagreement? Yes, but that's a disagreement about color, about a secondary quality, not about a primary quality. And remember, this is about the existence of things out there, so to speak. So the point is, at the end of the day, even though we're going to disagree about secondary qualities maybe, and even some particular subjective interpretations of the primary qualities, we all are experiencing something that seems to be out there beyond us. And those reports from everyone, if we're talking in terms of probability, seem to indicate the existence of something. Okay, so that's all for today. This one was a little bit longer, but we had to get through a lot, and I hope you guys understand. If you still have questions, as always, email me, check out the resources, and I will see you next time to talk about the next part of the essay concerning human understanding. See you around.